Hello and welcome back. Today we're taking a look at a new extra history series called, well, in this case, just simply President William McKinley. Now the first episode's called The Tariff King. We'll discuss that in a minute, I'm sure. But I wanted to kind of bring up why I was doing this really quick. It just came out. It's as simple as that. And I wanted to point that out because as someone who is still really early on in making these videos and doing reactions and things like that, I really like doing these immediate ones because I'm seeing a lot of good interaction, a lot of good discussion. I've seen a ton of super fun interactions on the recent videos that I've covered. The rest of the Pearl Harbor series is going to continue to come out weekly, and I will probably go through the President William McKinley series weekly as well as they release it. I'll be doing other videos in between. I promise to the commenter who asked for it all the way back on the very first video, I promise I'm looking at Kings and Generals. I'm just trying to find a good one that I can really kind of dig into for a video. And we'll get to that, I promise. But in the meantime, we're going to take a look at President William McKinley, who is a pretty fascinating point in American history. He's there for the turn of the century, the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s. He is, in many ways, the last of the Gilded Age presidents. After this, we get to Teddy Roosevelt, who's the first of what I would argue are the progressives. Him and Woodrow Wilson. Taft is a bit more questionable, but especially with his trust-busting portion, Taft would definitely fall into that grouping. But that means that McKinley is kind of the end of an era. Ever since the end of Reconstruction, we've been in, even during a decent chunk of Reconstruction, we've been in the Gilded Age. This era of extreme wealth, and not just extreme wealth, but extreme wealth disparity. Where it's very clearly evident the middle class, the upper class, the lower class. This is the era of tenements. This is the era of extreme work days, minimal safety requirements, and I'm sure that we're going to get into a lot of that. This is also really the end of the, I'm trying to think of the right way to put this. This is also kind of the end of the traditional expansionist imperial era. This is where we fully integrate Hawaii as a territory. This is where we are going to bring the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and all of these different Spanish territories during the Spanish-American War. So William McKinley is going to be kind of at the forefront of this massively shifting era. We don't have any major land acquisitions post-McKinley's president. Now, we still have an imperial age. Don't get me wrong. We have major imperial endeavors for the next several decades. But this is the end of the major taking of territory. Even beyond that, the Gilded Age itself is a fascinating period of industrialism. I do need to point out, though, that my specific knowledge of William McKinley is a bit more lacking. I love the big topics. I love the big pieces. I tend to try to avoid a lot of the great man history. I still get into it. It's almost impossible to not get into great man history in pretty much any period. Many history books, many stories focus on kings or generals that are primarily focused during that period. But we're going to go ahead and get started. I already saw the initial title card. Trust me, I haven't watched the full thing, but I did see the first about 2 seconds, which immediately goes to Buffalo, New York, which is where McKinley is eventually killed by Czolgosz. So we'll go ahead and get rolling into that. Let's take a look.
Buffalo, New York, September 5th, 1901. In what seems like a miracle, electric lights illuminate the soaring buildings of the Pan American Exposition. This is a World's Fair, one celebrating the continent that appears poised to make the 20th century the American century, and speaking is the man who made that happen. President William McKinley squints into the lights, giving the best speech of his life, one that, ironically, repudiates the protectionism and tariff policies that catapulted him to political office in the first place.
The period of exclusiveness is past. The expansion of our trade and commerce is the pressing problem. Commercial wars are unprofitable. A policy of goodwill and friendly trade relations will prevent reprisals. Reciprocity treaties are in harmony with the spirit of the times. Measures of retaliation are not.
He is arguing to end insularity and promote American free trade to the world. And that is fitting since his presidency has made the United States a global power. Yet out in the darkness is another man with a revolver in his pocket. A man who in less than 24 hours will kill an American president.
That's a really phenomenal introduction. And I let it keep going there because I wanted to kind of get through the whole of that speech segment. But McKinley built his initial political career, and a lot of this era is built on the idea of American industry becoming dominant, not just at home, but internationally. It's a very big deal. American markets and American industry. And that's why we see a lot of the tariffs early on to establish our industry here and prevent foreign markets from coming in, and by making them prohibitively expensive. If you don't know what a tariff is, it is a tax on an imported good paid by the importer. So let's say, because there's a number of different industrial powerhouses at this point. Japan is on the rise since the start of the Meiji Restoration. They've been industrializing incredibly quickly. Germany and England are major industrial powers in Europe. So the idea is, they have these specific markets. And I'm blanking on what their specific ones would be at this time. But let's say Germany's big market is steel. Let's say that England's is still textiles. This is incorrect. I'm just kind of giving you an example of what this is. So to protect American steel, because at this point, England and Germany have been doing a lot of these industries longer, and in many cases they are innovating just as fast, if not a little bit faster than the United States, because of the fact that they don't quite have the manpower to keep up with the U.S. They're starting to make things cheaper than American companies. To prevent those specific products from coming into the United States, we see protective tariffs go into place, saying, well, American steel costs about, let's say, 5% more than German steel. So when German steel comes here, that's a problem. So what we then do is we create a 6% tariff, and now that German steel that was initially cheaper is just a little bit more expensive than American steel, and therefore American steel has a more competitive advantage here in the U.S. Tariffs have been used in a variety of ways throughout history, usually, not always, usually and most effectively in a very targeted manner, saying this is a specific thing. And this specific product is coming in from a foreign nation and outpacing our own. But that is not the point. We're focused back here. I kind of wanted to explain what a tariff was in that structure. But McKinley, by the end of his presidency, is seeing that the United States has gone almost isolationist. We're kind of cutting off our connection to the rest of the world in everything but sales. And he sees that as a mistake. He thinks that that's going to be a problem for the United States long term if we don't work with other states. Which makes sense. Even beyond that, I do love the fact that they pointed out that he kind of helps lead the United States into this modern era where we're going to be dominant. Specifically, the Spanish-American War, as John Hay called it, I think it's John Hay said, the splendid little war. It's short and it's sweet, but it proves a few things. First off, the United States could go toe-to-toe with the European power. Even if it's a waning power, like Spain was at the end of the 1800s, we still beat a European power blow for blow, head on, and pretty substantially we beat them. We also did it quickly, and we were able to field troops in a two-front war on opposite sides of the planet, fighting in both the Caribbean and in the Philippines. That's a pretty big deal. And that really sets up the United States to be a dominant group. Meanwhile, the Battle of Manila is further proof that the age of the wooden sailing ship is over. I don't know what the proportion is for the Spanish fleet at that conflict, but it's pretty evident that the ironclads that the United States is rolling up with are just leagues above any wooden sailing ship. Alright, let's go ahead and get rolling.
This first part of our historical tale is brought to you by Nebula, but more on them and how you can see the second chapter of this McKinley series before anyone else after the episode.
That actually brings up something I wanted to ask. If anybody here subscribes to Nebula, tell me how it is. I've always kind of been interested because I like that idea that it's just a lot of different creators going there first and then coming to YouTube later. And I like the idea of all that being in the same spot, but I haven't had the drive to give it a shot. Tell me how you like that.
William McKinley has been called the architect of the American century. During his presidency, he led the United States through a transformation from a relatively insular nation to an outward-looking one, engaged in global trade, and was able to project power across the globe.
Now, if you're wondering why are we so insular at this point, it's a few reasons. The big one being the American Civil War. We were heavily focused on the years after the Civil War ends on not just rebuilding, but refocusing the state. The United States had gone through a bloody conflict, the deadliest conflict for Americans, if you include both Confederate and Union troops together, of any conflict that the United States has ever been a part of. And that is... I'm saying that, and now I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if it's the deadliest or the bloodiest, which would be number of casualties. I will double check that and tell you at the beginning of episode 2. But we're going to keep moving here for right now, and I'll come back to that later on. But that majorly damages the United States. And throughout this period, after the American Civil War is really where westward expansion takes off. The Great Plains, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad connecting the two coasts, creates this major connective tissue that allows for greater expansion in the West. One of the big reasons why interconnectivity was so important, and is so important today, globalization is so important today, is because borders are more or less set, and settlements, in a lot of cases, are more or less set. So if there needs to be a new resource brought in, unless you can find a vein within your borders, you've got to go outside of them. You have to go and buy from a foreign state, and therefore globalization becomes even more important. Whereas post-Civil War, as we're heading west, we are coming across pretty much everything that the nation needs to grow and expand. Michigan and Wisconsin provide huge amounts of lumber for the construction of new homes. The gold rushes and silver rushes of the West, and then the Black Hills, and the Cascades, all these different regions, finding these rare earth minerals, allows us to stay pretty much insular. We don't need to go overseas for a lot of these. And when we do go overseas, it's usually to trade. The reason why Commodore Matthew Perry goes to Japan and opens up Japan and to Americans is for trade. It's so we can sell things to them. The reason why the United States is so closely involved with preventing European domination in China, the open door letters and the process to keep China from being carved up like, say, Africa or South Asia, is specifically because we want to maintain open trade with China, which is a massive market. And that's a big deal. We need people to buy our goods if we are an export-centric nation. And we need to be on good relations and good focus with that, but not beyond the economic structure at this point. So we'll get to that. I'm not sure. I think that we're going to get to the point eventually in the series where they talk about the Boxer Rebellion and sending troops overseas there, but I don't know for a fact. Today, we're going back to the tariffs, though.
He won a massively successful war, added to the country's first colonial possessions, and wrestled with running a modern economy.
So we'll see here that major war is the Spanish-American War. We see the Kingdom of Hawaii in the middle there, which becomes a U.S. territory under McKinley. And we see the Philippines in the bottom, which is a U.S. territory up until 1946, when it gains its independence on July 4th. And this is also a major part of our economy. Here. We are one of the industrial states at the turn of the century. And we aren't just one of them. We have only about 50 years approximately. Give me a second. I'm going to tell you really. I'm going to get this. (1856). Okay, yes. So, I also need to point out that an American also comes up with this more or less the same time. But we largely give Henry Bessemer of England the focus on the new process for steel. That steel industry, starting in 1856, is what's really going to drive the new era of heavy industry. More focused on metals and bigger products that need to be traveled and taken on trains, which have greatly expanded since the 1830s and expand even further throughout the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. The 1890s is where a lot of those are going to crash hard. Those railroads are also going to be the kind of progenitor, the initial groups that create what is today the stock market, the idea of partial ownership for many different groups to fund and invest in these different programs. It's not just the railroads. We'd seen this before. The English and the Dutch had done it with their foreign trading companies. But here in the United States, the big kind of driver of that maintains afterward is going to be the railroads.
However, today, he's mostly known for having been assassinated, paving the way for his much flashier successor, Theodore Roosevelt.
Which I'm sure they're going to get into this eventually too. Theodore Roosevelt was put in that position so that he would be useless. He had been so effective in rooting out corruption and going after different groups when he was governor of New York that they tried to put him in the most useless position, and then Czolgosz ends up coming in and killing McKinley, and now we have a Teddy Roosevelt presidency. That's besides the point. We're moving on.
McKinley is often called a forgotten president, but that's not really true. For instance, while he may not be well remembered nationally, he's revered in his burial place of Canton, Ohio, where he's looked on as almost a slain martyr. He's also remembered outside the continental US, though much less fondly. In the Philippines, he's seen as supporting the struggle for independence before betraying it in favor of colonial domination. In
Yeah, and I don't think that's necessarily an incorrect take. Emiliano Aguinaldo, who was the leader of the Filipino resistance against the Spanish, thought that the U.S. was coming in to help liberate and free the Philippines. We were not there for that. We were there to beat the Spanish and then keep the islands, at least initially. Now, there was a lot of debate about that in the U.S. Congress, and for varying reasons, some of them moral. They should have their own freedom. We should allow them to be there. Some anti-Catholic, because anti-Catholic sentiment was high in the United States at the time, and the Philippines was overwhelmingly a Catholic nation. So there was a lot of xenophobic groups, a lot of nativists who said, we don't want Catholics, a nation full of Catholics, to become part of the United States. And of course, there are the racists who looked at the fact that it was a nation made up of Filipinos, a foreign ethnic group that they could separate and make other. And that's kind of why the Philippines never gets integrated in. There's many different groups who all oppose its integration, and for very different reasons. But that makes sense. Also, Canton, Ohio is where he's from. It's where he campaigned out of. I was going to say something else, but we'll wait till we get to the actual running for president to discuss it. If you also watch Vlogging Through History, which you should, he's very good at what he does. He's one of the reasons why I do this. He talks about William McKinley with a lot of reverence, which makes sense because he's from Ohio. I believe that he's from not Canton itself, but within a reasonable distance from Canton. Kind of like how I would say that I am a reasonable distance from Pittsburgh or Buffalo. I'm like equal distance between them. But we're moving on here.
China, there are museums dedicated to the looting carried out by U.S. Marines who, sent by McKinley, sacked the Imperial Summer Palace during the Boxer Rebellion. Yep. And in Rob's hometown of Honolulu, McKinley's role in annexing Hawaii is still controversial enough that there have been multiple attempts to rename a high school christened in his honor and remove a statue of him from the grounds. Which is...
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. It is kind of funny, though, because McKinley, who's kind of the last president of the Gilded Age, and his death is going to usher in the rise of the Progressive Age, is kind of seen in a similar light, just reversed to Woodrow Wilson, the end of the Progressive presidents, in the fact that McKinley is pretty well liked in the United States. Not universally. It's pretty well liked in the United States. But the territories that were foreign at that point, like Hawaii, or nations that are today foreign, like the Philippines or China, despise him. Whereas Woodrow Wilson was widely, and is still widely, celebrated in Western Europe for the American assistance in World War I and his efforts to broker peace, as well as despised in the United States for the horrific actions he took against African Americans, and the failed policies that he had in a number of ways, and the missionary diplomacy of sending troops to neighboring states. We often forget about the fact that we invaded Mexico right before World War I. You know what? The Great War has a series on that I haven't watched yet that I think would be very good. So I might go back and watch that in the near future, but we're moving on.
It's all really interesting in its contrast, because by all accounts, it was hard to dislike McKinley personally. He was amiable, friendly, rarely had a crossword for anyone, and was an unusually devoted husband for the time. In short, he was a nice guy, whose policy decisions resulted in terrible things, often halfway around the globe.
Yep.
But That
Well,
kind of international
No, we're gonna
reach
talk
was
about it. This is gonna be like a 2-hour video if I keep stopping.
unimaginable when McKinley was born in January of 1843. The 7th child out of 9, raised in a strict Methodist household. He received a good education and had some college by the time the Civil War broke out in 1861. And McKinley, raised in an abolitionist household, put his mother's protestations aside and joined up as a private at the age of 18. And he'd end the war having gained 4 significant things: a brevet promotion to major, a friendship with the future President Rutherford B. Hayes, a deep appreciation for the horrors of war, and a reputation for unbelievable bravery.
It is also fair to point out a lot of post-war presidents are veterans. Grant, of course, is probably the most famous Union general of the war. Or Hayes serves, Cleveland serves, McKinley serves. I don't think Harrison serves. I do believe that Chester Arthur serves. Does Garfield serve? I think Garfield serves as well. So I think pretty much up until the end of up until the turn of the century, I think pretty much every president other than Harrison. Give me a second. I'm gonna double check. Give me a second. Fight the Civil War. That's not. That's not what I meant to select. Yep. So Chester Arthur did. Now the only one that I'm questioning is, did Benjamin Harrison? Oh, I didn't realize that Arthur's still in there. No, Harrison did serve. So I think every president post-war, other than Andrew Johnson, served in the American Civil War up until the turn of the century. I might be wrong about that. Please tell me if I am wrong, but we don't have time to stop now. But yeah, that's a good point. And I do also like to point out that they were connected.
McKinley largely served as a commissary officer, delivering food, ammunition, and messages to the front line, often under heavy fire. He participated in 11 battles, including Antietam, which at nearly 23,000 casualties still ranks as the bloodiest day of combat in U.S. history. And in those engagements, he became famous for taking assignments that were considered suicide missions. More than once, Hayes dispatched him with a wagon of supplies, not believing he'd return, and he once had his horse shot out from under him. McKinley was justly proud of his service, and even once president, preferred to be called the Major. After the war, he returned to Ohio and began building a life for himself, studying law and opening a lucrative legal practice in the growing manufacturing hub of Canton. And from there, it didn't take him long to step into local politics. In 1867, his old commander Rutherford B. Hayes ran for governor on the Republican ticket, and McKinley stumped for him, helping Hayes win a highly polarized district. McKinley's talent for politics was clear enough that he ran for prosecutor in the same district 2 years later, managing a surprise win for an office that had been long held by Democrats. Granted, he was ousted 2 years later, but it showed promise. Now, as McKinley and
That's a big deal. Just the ability to kind of step in and do those things. You'll notice something else, that he starts off as a lawyer. The number of presidents and even just now, the Congress and Senate are overwhelmingly filled with lawyers, which does make it difficult to have them connect with outside groups, and makes it a really disproportionate representation of the nation. But it also makes a lot of sense. Lawyers spend their life working with the law, and who better to write the law than someone who spends their life working with it. I put the better because there are wild swings in quality among lawyers, everything else. And there are many, many, many individuals who have never been a lawyer or never worked with the law who go into Congress and do great jobs. So I just wanted to point that out. But that's beside the point. Moving on here.
And his legal partner were cleaning up financially, he decided he wanted to embark on a new partnership. This time, a personal one. Walking to his Methodist church to teach Sunday school, McKinley kept passing a woman walking the other way to teach Sunday school at the Presbyterian church, Ida Saxton. She was a member of a prominent family who, at the time, were unusual in their support of equal education for women. Ida had attended boarding school and a finishing school, then controversially had taken a job as a clerk at her father's bank before touring Europe. One day, he passed her a note suggesting that they walk together, and after a year of courtship, they married in January of 1871, embarking on what promised to be an idyllic family life. They had a daughter, Katie, quickly got pregnant again, but then everything started going wrong. Ida's mother passed away, and at the funeral, Ida fell from a carriage and sustained a head injury. Then their second daughter died a few months after birth, and Ida entered a deep depression, which only deepened when less than 2 years later, their remaining daughter, Katie, died at age 4. Ida.
That's so sad. And it's one of those things that it's hard to recognize, or it's hard to quantify just how much this can hurt someone. It makes it arguably even more impressive what he'll eventually manage to do. But God, that sucks.
Then began suffering epileptic seizures, possibly due to the head injury, and William stepped in as her caregiver, staying physically close to her as much as possible for the rest of their lives. However, she insisted that he not give up his political ambitions. And McKinley's political star was rising. After defending 21 striking miners charged with rioting and getting all but one off, McKinley suddenly found himself both with working-class political support and a new ally in Mark Hanna, a Republican Party kingmaker. Ironically, Hanna had been one of...
So he's a party boss at this point. That makes sense. Not McKinley, Hanna.
The mine owners in the dispute, but put that aside when he saw the young lawyer's potential. McKinley ran for the House of Representatives in the 1876 election, while supporting his mentor Hayes for president that same year. The presidential election ended up too close to call, and Hayes only took office once the Republicans struck the Compromise of 1876, agreeing to end Reconstruction in the South in exchange for taking the presidency. And oh boy, does that deserve an episode one day. So
I'm sure that would be a great one. There is a lot to go into with Hayes. It's kind of important to recognize that, A, if Samuel Tilden had won, he would have arguably ended it on day one. It would have been over even quicker than with Hayes going in under the bargain of 1877, or 1876, sorry. Under the bargain of 1876, or anything else really there. But that's kind of beside the point. I do think that'd be a really cool episode. I love the way that they tell their stories and they do this. Now, I am curious, because usually these videos are like 8 minutes long or so. This is 18, and I am concerned that this is going to be so much longer.
we mark it down, you know the drill. Who knew there was this much history? McKinley, though, he won his election handily. And his greatest policy? Protectionism. In McKinley's mind, America's rapidly expanding manufacturing and agricultural sectors needed to be shielded from having their prices undercut by the more established manufacturers in Europe. Now, the United States had already levied tariffs on imports, which is how it raised revenue before the national income tax and had paid off its debts from the Civil War.
It's important to recognize as well that right now, national income tax does not exist on a permanent level. There was a national income tax established during the American Civil War to help pay for the cost of that conflict, but it's not actually going to become a national thing. The actual income tax doesn't become a thing fully until the 16th Amendment under Woodrow Wilson's presidency that creates the ability for the federal government to do this. So instead, at this point, it's tariffs, and it is a variety of things, but it's tariffs, fees, and a big one is excise taxes, specifically on things like whiskey. We don't have time to dive into that fully right now, but those are all big pieces.
In fact, the U.S. was in such good financial position due to collecting tariffs and controlling spending that by the time McKinley was in Congress, it was running on a budget surplus. Though, keep in mind, the U.S. also provided little to no social services and had a relatively small military.
Yeah, this is before the era of American military might being what it is. This is around the same time that we see people like Alfred Mahan. I believe that Mahan predates McKinley in the presidency, but Alfred Mahan puts out a big push to expand the U.S. Navy, which dramatically expands the U.S. naval budget, but makes it one of the most formidable on the planet, which is very important in the build-up to what we talked about in the other series that we've been reacting to with Pearl Harbor. And the day-to-day operation of the federal government was pretty darn minimal in the everyday Americans' lives. Like, for instance, if you were going to interact with the federal government, the most you would ever probably interact with them, and to be fair, we still interact with them pretty regularly now, but it's the USPS, the Postal Service, was kind of the extent that most everyday Americans were going to ever have to deal with the federal government in the late 1800s.
Over the next 14 years, he'd serve Ohio in the House of Representatives, becoming the Republicans' main advocate for tariffs, while trying to remain moderate on other domestic issues like currency. He was popular, and at one point, when Democrats redistricted his seat, causing him to lose re-election, he managed to get elected again in the next cycle. And through it all, he made protectionism his hallmark. "I am a tariff man," he'd say, "standing on a tariff platform." By 1889, he was one of the most prominent Republican members of Congress, an incredibly distinguished and stately man who was often said to look like Napoleon, a resemblance, it should be said, that political cartoonists of the day put to wicked use. But it was in that year that McKinley was made chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, where he could help steer his pet project, a bill called the McKinley Tariff. The final legislation was not exactly what McKinley had envisioned. It had hundreds of amendments. In fact, it actually removed tariffs on a number of goods the U.S. did not produce, like sugar, molasses, tea, and coffee.
Weirdly enough, that removal of tariffs on sugar is going to be one of the driving pieces toward the overthrowing of the monarchy in Hawaii that eventually leads to McKinley bringing Hawaii in, because Hawaii specifically had been exempt from that sugar tariff and as a result could easily sell to Americans without having to compete with foreign markets, which is a pretty big deal. This is also, you may hate it, you may love it. It doesn't really matter. This is also how American lawmaking works. And it's actually why it's not uncommon to see someone propose a bill and then eventually vote no on it because the amendments have changed what that bill is. In many cases, that's just how this works. There's a whole amendment process. You can change and alter parts of the bill with congressional approval. And eventually that bill can look very different than the original. It is almost unheard of for a bill to be proposed, accepted, voted on, and moved on without any kind of amendment or alteration by Congress as a whole.
No sense in tariffing things you can't produce domestically, right? 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 Because that would make no sense, right? You might as well start asking ChatGPT to tariff some penguins and destroy my retirement account. Anyway.
We're not going to touch modern politics with a million-foot pole. We're not.
It also raised tariffs on things like wool and tin plate, industries that were still developing in the US. Tin plate, in particular, was targeted. These were plates of thin steel lined with tin to prevent rusting, used in cheap pots and pans, roof tiles, and the manufacture of tin cans and boxes. Most of the tin plate bought in the US was manufactured in the UK, at least until the McKinley tariff nearly destroyed the UK tin plate industry overnight, when the tariff went from 30% to 70%. Ironically, many Cornish and Welsh tin plate workers who lost their jobs due to the McKinley tariff ended up immigrating to the United States. Similar rates were raised on...
And that's kind of the idea. It sucks, and it's terrible. Realistically, tariffs are going to have a major impact on any country that has it levied against them. But in a nation... But you see the dichotomy here. It's incredibly destructive to the English economy, but it's also going to prevent the English from maintaining a hold on that and allow American companies to catch up and surpass English production. It sucks. It really does, the impacts that it brings in. But that's kind of the whole idea, that we're going to protect the American industry while cutting off our interactions and trade with English interactions for it.
Imported wool from the UK. So, did the McKinley tariffs work? Well, kinda. It sped up the domestic manufacture of tin plate a bit, but at the cost of massive and immediate price increases for Americans across a whole range of goods.
And that's also something that we tend to see with tariffs. We tend to see, because the idea is we'll make the foreign good a little bit more expensive than the American good, but what a lot of American companies do is they will raise it to whatever that foreign good is, and now it's a competitive market, but without anything else really supporting it. Also, because of the fact that the foreign market has now stopped producing, in this case, we stopped buying from those, or in many cases, the prices jumped dramatically for foreign goods. Now, there's a much higher demand for American tin plate. And when there's a much higher demand, it's very simple supply-demand economics. There's a lot of idiosyncrasies and differences in economic systems that we just really don't have time to go into here. So we're going to keep it with the real simple supply and demand. But when that demand skyrockets through the roof, price is going to go up too, because guess what? We cannot shift and alter the production rate of this at the same time. By the way, I'm sorry if that got really muffled there for a second. I did this as like a joke of like, hey, I'm just saying the quiet part directly to you, that we don't have time to go into all this, which we don't on pretty much any of the videos. But I should have done this because my mic is now on the right side of me, whereas before it was the USB mic, which I'm looking directly at. Sorry.
And y'all, people hated it. In fact, they hated it so much that in the 1890 election, it was a bloodbath for Republicans in the House of Representatives.
So we're about to see. So you'll see here, this is also one of the more interesting periods in American political party structure. This is the closest we have to a straightforward shattering of the two-party system. There's a lot of periods where like other big parties will pop up for a second and they'll get shot down almost immediately. What we tend to see is they get shot down not so much because people dislike their ideas, but mostly because they'll be adopted or brought in by a larger party. But this period of time, we see three major parties: the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Populists. And the Populists have gained huge just success in the West. American farmers and laborers out West love the Populist Party. And we're going to see a huge number of seats flip to them. I would love to talk about the Populist Party another day. Its origins with farmers' unions, and while not directly the influence of things like the Grange or the Ocala platform, the Ocala platform more directly leading to the creation of the Populist Party, but oh goodness, I can't wait.
Representatives, where they went from 171 seats to 88.
Yeah. And remember, this is the first national populist election. They get 8 seats. This isn't an era where there are 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives. There aren't. So now you see a major shift here. And a matter of fact, populist candidates almost win the White House. I'm sure we're going to get to one of McKinley's main opponent, who's going to be a problem individually. But he is going to start off with the populist platform and then eventually run for the Democrats, William Jennings Bryan. But let's continue.
McKinley himself lost, albeit narrowly and partially due to gerrymandering. Yet he still remained popular in Ohio and was easily elected governor in the next cycle, but that was just a springboard.
Yep.
Republican President Benjamin Harrison was unpopular, and though McKinley supported him in the 1892 election, it was common knowledge that McKinley was building alliances to make his own run in 1896. And as it happened, Harrison lost, which might have been lucky for the Republicans, because that meant the Democrats took the heat for the Panic of 1893, a financial crisis that would be the worst in American history until the Great Depression.
Yeah, Panic of 1893 is going to devastate the country. It's one of the first truly global financial crashes as well. You can see the impact that industrialization has created in terms of globalization and interconnectivity between nations, in the fact that the Panic of 1893 pretty much crashes the global industrialized economy. It is horrifically rough, and it's largely built off the backs of the failures of American railroad organizations that have overextended themselves in the mad dash. It's kind of similar to how around the year 2000 we have the dot-com bubble burst, where we just saw a new technology in the 1800s. It was railroads. In the 90s, it was the internet. Dramatically expanded what we did on that. And then eventually, when everything started to contract back to a more manageable level, the whole market disintegrated. And this has a few different effects here. First off, Grover Cleveland is an incredibly impressive president on his own. Prior to Donald Trump, he was the only non-consecutive two-term president, having won initially, lost to Harrison, and then Harrison, being unpopular, loses to Cleveland in the next election in 92. Now we're moving on here. We're getting closer and closer and closer to McKinley's run for president.
There were a lot of causes, of course. A collapse in grain prices, a railway bubble, a bill that caused the Treasury to buy large amounts of silver, and a run on gold due to a bank failure in Argentina. But one factor were the McKinley tariffs.
Yeah, and all those things. I want to point out that if anyone comes up to you and goes, this recession, this depression, this thing has a singular, one alone cause, they are wrong. Usually it's because they've been taught that a singular one was the cause. It never is. Like, for instance, in 2008, the big thing that everybody thinks of is the subprime mortgage crisis, the collapse of the housing bubble. But there's a variety of things that we'd seen kind of bubbling up under the surface throughout that period. Don't have time to dive into it, but there's a lot of them. It's not just the stock market crash in 1929 that causes the Great Depression. It is many things. And these all kind of have impacts here. The railroad bubble has been huge. Railroad companies have dramatically overextended themselves. The grain production. This is a major period of mechanization in American farming, and that's going to cause nightmarish supply-demand wackiness. And because of the fact that the railroads are a problem in the late 1800s. One of the big reasons why the Populist Party even comes to power is because of their hatred of the railroads, and because of the fact that the people that were voting for them also hated the railroads. There's also the debates between the gold bugs and the silverbacks. I think I'm misremembering what the terms are there. But there's this big debate over whether or not the U.S. should be solely focused on a gold standard, or if we should have what's called bimetallism, using both silver and gold that would artificially inflate the U.S. economy, and specifically artificially inflate the value of our currency, which would mean that farmers out west that were having grain, which was their main crop, crash sales-wise. The hope was that this would then lead to them being able to sell off or pay off their debts easier because they are artificially raising the sale price of grain through inflation. We don't have time to dive into all this, but all of this does make sense as causes and build-ups to the 1983 peace. It's also a great example of the fact that people generally don't care if you cause something or not. If it happens during your presidency, they will give you that. They will put that on your back. Grover Cleveland gets that hard with the Panic of 1893. Literally, he has not been president for years. For 4 years, he hasn't been president. And then when he comes into power, problems. And as a result, many people just tie him directly to the panic.
And who would reap the benefit of the Democrats being blamed? William McKinley, who entered the race for the presidency in the 1896 election. But he would have to work for it, because his Democratic opponent was William Jennings Bryan, a young popular orator who went on a whistle-stop tour of the country, sometimes delivering as many as 34 speeches in a day. He rallied against the Republicans and their big business cronies, and advocated for, quote, free silver, an idea that mining interests should increase the money supply by directly striking silver coins without government control.
And that scares a lot of people, as it probably should. That is a rather crazy idea. But he also gains a lot of support. One of his most famous speeches is the Cross of Gold speech, which is the idea that the farmers and the laborers of the United States were carrying a cross of gold. The focus on the gold standard was basically crushing those lower groups under its weight. And he believed that this new silver coinage would inflate those and lessen the burden on them, on the everyday worker, and move it up to the rich and the powerful.
This would cause inflation, but he argued that would benefit American producers by increasing the money supply. McKinley, on the other hand, was a gold bug. While he was interested in mixing some silver into the reserve, he wanted to keep America on the gold standard to keep things stable and avoid inflation. Early on, Bryan looked like he'd sweep Election Day.
He was going massively crazy. He was hopping on a train. They were literally going from train station to train station to train station. And then that's where he would give his speeches. He'd go out, he'd meet with the crowd, he'd give his speech, and then that's how he's able to do like 30 a day on his most insane campaign days. Meanwhile, William McKinley, I'm going to sit back. I'm going to relax. And I know that we're about to get into it, but the statement was, he campaigned from his porch. Which is where he allowed the media to come to him and talk and answer questions.
McKinley, now 53, couldn't keep up with Bryan's energy and was nowhere near as good a speaker. So, why try to play the same game? Instead, he launched the first Front Porch campaign, making it known that he would receive visitors at his home in Canton for 6 days a week. People would come to him, making use of America's now vast rail network. And come they did. Delegations of men visiting from counties across the United States. Interested groups, even all-women delegations came, promising to lobby their husbands to vote McKinley. It all happened in a genial party atmosphere, and by the end of the campaign, over 750,000 people had made the pilgrimage.
It worked.
McKinley also engaged big business, which feared Bryan and his populist policies. Railroads backed McKinley by offering discounted tickets to his Canton home. Factories told workers and suppliers they would have to shut down or cancel orders if Bryan was elected.
And this is where we get to that idea that we previously saw them talking about with William Jennings Bryan and the populists, and of course the Democrats now who are supporting Bryan, calling out the idea of crony capitalism, because this is where we get to the kind of corruption of the Gilded Age. For a company who likes William McKinley to offer direct discounts on tickets if you are going to visit and meet with and discuss things with that presidential candidate, that's some pretty big cronyism.
By offering discounted tickets to his Canton home, factories told workers
and telling your workers, hey, we're gonna close down. Now there is a thing here. It is fair if you are pointing out, hey, listen, this policy is going to be really detrimental. We'd have to cut workers. We'd have to do this. We'd have to do that. But this is a rather large concerted pitch during this period. That, hey, things aren't going to go well for us if Bryan comes out. And this is going to be a big thing coming into the early 2000s, and why we end up seeing Supreme Court cases around the idea that big corporations were counted effectively as people when it came to these kinds of political actions.
Workers and suppliers, they would have to shut down or cancel orders if Bryan was elected. Yeah. And some employers even threatened layoffs and put campaign literature into pay envelopes.
Yeah, which is also super screwy. It's important to also point out that we haven't adopted the secret ballot or the anonymous ballot or the Australian ballot, as it was nicknamed, nationwide yet. That's going to come later. In a lot of areas of the country, who you voted for was public record. And a lot of corporations would threaten individuals. Or, I shouldn't say a lot. There are a number that did threaten firings or layoffs of individuals that voted against company interests.
Oh, and the tycoons also gave money, donating $3.5 million to McKinley's campaign, 7 times what Bryan had received, and possibly more than the total of all previous campaign contributions in American history. I'm sure that won't snowball into something destructive in years to come. That money went into a blizzard of campaign materials, from posters to little gold bug buttons. Oh yeah, that's right. McKinley's 1896 campaign invented the campaign button as well as the direct mailer. Because you might have to go to McKinley's porch to see him, but he was also in your mailbox as well. This has actually been called America's first modern political campaign. And come election night, McKinley crushed Bryan in the Electoral College, though the popular vote was uncomfortably close.
Yeah, it really was. Bryan was very similar to Henry Clay in being a perennial almost president. He runs 3 times, he does well each of those times, but Taft kind of destroys him with one line the 3rd time that he runs. You can vote for Bryan anytime. You can only vote for Taft once. And that kind of shatters that idea, because Bryan keeps getting close and never quite crosses the finish line. Very similar to what happens with Henry Clay throughout the early 1800s, where he keeps getting closer and closer, and tries to run and tries to run and tries to run, but never ends up taking the office. He's always important in American politics, but he never actually crosses the finish line.
McKinley's economic argument had propelled him to the White House. Yet, ironically, his presidency would be dominated not by questions of protectionism, but of imperialism.
Yeah.
For as we'll see next week, trouble was brewing in the Caribbean, and McKinley, who was skeptical of wars and expressed little interest in overseas territories, was about to plunge headlong into the Spanish-American War. But, y'all, there is...
Alright, I'm sure that he's got more. We're going to end it here. That is, oh my god, it's an hour-long video. This is the longest video I've ever put out. But we're going to take a look next time at that and roll from there. Yeah. We're just going to call it here. I will see you next week. I'll record an episode off of episode 2, which looks like it's going into the Spanish-American War and the impacts there. So, we'll see you next one. Have a good day. Bye.